We begin today the Gemara on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph, the second line from the top. Tana Rabbanon, Sukkah Gezula, a stolen Sukkah. V'amesachach b'Rishus Harabim, and one that builds his Sukkah in Rishus Harabim. Rabbi Eliezer Paisel, the Chachamim Machshirin. Rabbi Eliezer says this Sukkah is possible, and Chachamim say it's kosher. Amar Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman explains, when it says there in the Braisa, a stolen Sukkah, what exactly are we talking about? What of the Sukkah is stolen? Machloikis, the argument here is b'sheteikif es chaveiroi, in a case where a person goes and forces his friend v'yitzia misukasei and takes him out of his sukkah. In other words, what he's stealing is the person's territory. He has a sukkah built in his house, on his ground, in his territory. You're stealing that piece of territory, that piece of land, with the sukkah that's built on it. Here's where there's a machloikis. Now, what's the basis of their machlekes? Rabbi Eliezer follows his opinion. That you're not yetsa on sukkahs, the mitzvah of sukkah, if the sukkah is not yours. It says Chag HaSukkah tasa l'cha. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we learned this in the previous Perek, the sukkah has to be yours. So therefore, if you're kicking your friend out of his sukkah, you're not going to be yetsa the mitzvah of sukkah. But the thing is, essentially, what is he stealing? He's stealing the ground, the territory, karka. And we brought before in the Gemara that karka is actually something that the concept of gzeila doesn't apply to it. It always remains in the possession of the owner. So over here you're stealing the territory together with the sukkah that's on it. Even the sukkah, which is kavua, built in this place, it's attached to the ground, is considered to be also that you're stealing a piece of karka. So what's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion here? Is this karka have the definition of gzeila, that you stole it, or no? The concept of gzeila does not apply to this. So the Gemara will explain. If Rabbi Eliezer holds that when you steal a piece of karka, the concept of gzeila does apply to it, you become a gazlan, so then sukkah gzulihi. So you're being yetsa the mitzvah with a stolen sukkah. It's not yours. If you're not mikarka ain't an gzelas, even if you're going to say that kicking your friend out of his sukkah, so essentially you're stealing the piece of territory. That's something that the concept of gzeila doesn't apply to. It always belongs to the owner, remains in the owner's possession. So then shuli. So even if it's not defined as gzeila, but it's like a borrowed sukkah, you're using the sukkah that doesn't belong to you. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, it makes no difference. Either way, whether it's a borrowed sukkah or a stolen sukkah, it's not locha and you're not yetsa. Rashi actually points out that the truth is that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the Gemara in Baba Kama is that karka is nigzelis. So really it's a stolen sukkah. Only reason the Gemara says that Mumanav Shach, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you wouldn't be yetsa, because the Gemara wants to make it clear what Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is, as we've learned in the previous Perek, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it doesn't really matter whether it's a stolen sukkah, whether it's a borrowed sukkah. Either way, you're not yetsa the mitzvah because it's not your sukkah. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. But Rabbana l'tamayu, and Rabbana, their opinion is, the Amri, they say, first of all, Adam yetzi yedechevasai b'sukasa shachaveirei. You can be yetzi the mitzvah with a sukkah that belongs to your friend. In other words, a borrowed sukkah. You can be yetzi the mitzvah. You can't be yetzi the mitzvah with a stolen sukkah, but you could be yetzi with a borrowed sukkah. The karka ain't an gzelas. The concept of gzeila does not apply to a piece of territory. It's always in the possession of the owner. So when you're using the sukkah, you're essentially borrowing the use of the sukkah from this person. And therefore, the sukkah shulihi, it's a borrowed sukkah, and according to the Rabbanan, you're yetsa with a borrowed sukkah. Avol, however, another scenario of gzeila, of stealing a sukkah. Not where you stole the actual territory and you kicked the person out of a sukkah. But gozal eitzim v'sichach behen. You stole the materials for the sukkah. You stole wood for your schach maybe, and you're using it then for the schach. So over here, divrei akail, everybody would agree, ein lo ela dmei eitzim. The owner of these pieces of wood only gets the value, the money that you have to pay him back for it, but the actual schach that's built into your sukkah, the gazlan can keep, it's his, and therefore he can be yetsa the mitzvah with this. What's the reason for this? So we'll see it soon in the Gemara, and Rashi here brings with the takana that there is, that Chachamim were masakin for a person to be able to have an easier time to do tshuva, takonas hashavim, or the Gemara soon calls it takonas marish, that when you steal a piece of wood and you build it into your house, into a building, so because it's a big tirchet to take it apart and return the actual piece of wood that you stole, you can keep it there built into the house, and you just have to pay back the value for it. So the Gemara here is saying that the same applies to wood that you stole, that you built into your sukkah. That it's part of your sukkah, And even though Sukkot is only 7 days, and seemingly it's just a temporary structure, and it should be easier to take out, but because this is the mitzvah of Sukkah, of these 7 days, so therefore it has chshivus, as Rashi here brings later, that it's a kabinyan kva. It's not considered to be a temporary structure. For these 7 days, it's considered to be a permanent structure that you built this wood into, and therefore you don't have to return the wood itself, just the value of it. And therefore you can be yaitze with this wood, the mitzvah of Sukkah, according to everybody. So those are the two cases that the Gemara speaks about. And the Gemara here explains and brings the comparison to what it says in the Braisa after this. Mimai, how do we know that we're speaking about a person that stole the territory for a Sukkah? Not that he stole the wood, the materials for the Sukkah. Mediktani, because in the Braisa gives another example. Dum yidrish sarabim. Similar, the first case was a stolen Sukkah, but then the second case was that you built a Sukkah in the Rish Hashanah. So it's similar to a Sukkah being built in the Rish Hashanah. Marish Hashanah, karkalav dideyu, just like in the case of the Rish Hashanah. What is it that's being stolen? The territory, the piece of karka and the Rish Hashanah. So kanami lav karka dideyu. So too over here, when we're speaking about a stolen sukkah, the machlokes of Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon is regarding a case where it's the actual karka that was stolen and not the materials that were stolen. Because if the materials were stolen, then the sukkah belongs to you, as we've explained. So now Rashi and Tosfos both address here a question, and that is that did we have before in the Gemara where it said that according to the Rabbanon, a stolen sukkah you can't be yaitze the mitzvah? In what case did the Rabbanon say that? According to what the Gemara says over here, we have two scenarios of gzeila, and in both cases, Rabbanon hold that you yaitze the mitzvah. If it's a case where you stole the karka, you yaitze the mitzvah because there is no gzeila on karka. If it's a case where you stole the materials and built it into the sukkah, according to the Rabbanon, you're also yaitze because the materials are now yours to keep. You just have to pay back the value. So Rashi answers is a third scenario. If a person builds a sukkah not on a piece of karka, he builds the sukkah on a wagon or on a ship, which we had the example before in the Mishnah. So in such a case, if you stole that sukkah that's not on a piece of karka, so you're stealing the sukkah, you kick your friend out of that sukkah. So because it's not on a piece of land, you're not stealing a piece of territory, you're stealing the agola, the wagon that the sukkah is built on. Over there is the case where the Rabbanan say that you won't be yaitze the mitzvah because it's a stolen sukkah. Sagt the Gemara weiter, Hahi Safta, there was this older woman, that came in front of Rav Nachman. Omralein, she said to Rav Nachman, Reish Galusa, the head of the Galus, the Reish Galusa, the Kula Rabbanan, and all the other Rabbanan, the Beireish Galusa, that are by the Reish Galusa, Besukah Gzula V'Yasfi. They're sitting in a stolen sukkah. In other words, they stole the materials, the wood that they're using for the sukkah from me, and they're not being yaitze the mitzvah. It's a stolen sukkah. Tzavcha, she was screaming, V'layashkach ba, and Rav Nachman didn't pay attention to her. V'layashkach ba Rav Nachman. Amralei, she said to him, Itza, a woman, the Havalela Avua Tlas Meya Tamni Sari Avdi, a woman that has 300, her father had 318 servants. So Rashi here says that she was saying this about Avraham Avinu. The pasuk there says that Avraham Avinu had 318 servants that went with him to chase the people over there to save light. Others say that Ra'ah says that it actually refers to her father that was a very rich man and had 318 servants. And you're not looking at me. V'lo yashgicha bei. Salcha kamaychu is screaming in front of you, V'lo yashgichisu ba, and you're not paying attention to me. So she was upset that he was ignoring her. Amalu Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to his students that was sitting there, Paisihida, this woman is a screamer. She's making a big commotion, but really she has no case. Ve'ein la ela demei eitzim bulvad. This wood that was stolen from her, since it was built into the sukkah, it's too late. Now the takana of Chazal applies that it stays there in the sukkah, and they only have to return the value, the money of it, and they're yaitze the mitzvah of sukkah, as we said before. The Ksav Sofer says a nice pshat. Reason why Rav Nachman didn't pay attention to her, he could have told her this, but really he wanted her to wait until after Sukkot, because as the Gemara is soon going to say, after Sukkot, then you could get back the materials itself, because now there's no mitzvah of sukkah anymore, so the owner does get back the materials itself that was stolen from him. It's only during the 7 days of Sukkot that you don't have to pay back the materials itself, you pay back the money. So he wanted her to wait until after Sukkot, but she was persistent. She wanted to get back her schach right now. So that Rav Nachman was ignoring it so that she should wait. But in the end, he had to tell her that the way it is, that right now she's not going to get anything. Amar Ravina said, Hai kshura de metalalte, de gazula of the lerabanan takante mishum takanas meirish. So, what does this mean? A kshura de metalalta is boards that are used for the sukkah. So if it was stolen, the takana of the rabbanan, which is called takanas marish, the takana of the pieces of wood that are stolen and are built into a structure, applies in this case. In other words, just like the general takana, as I mentioned before, a gazlan that steals and builds it into a house, he doesn't have to return those materials itself as a big tircha. So too by sukkahs, if it's built into the house, you don't have to return this itself, you return just the money of it. So the Gemara wants to understand, what's the chiddush over here? We said this already before. Fragt the Gemara pshita, it's obvious, my shnami eitzim. Why should it be any different from what we mentioned before regarding wood that was stolen from the sukkah? Before we were talking about pieces of wood stolen. Now we're talking about boards that are being used for the sukkah. What should be the difference? So the Gemara answers, I would think there is a difference. Eitzim shchichi, pieces of wood are more common to come to. And therefore I would say that in this case we apply the takana of Chazal that the gazlan keeps the pieces of wood built into the sukkah and the owner will be paid for them and he won't have such a hard time to find other pieces of wood to buy. Aval hai, but when you're talking about boards, it's not as common to find. So in such a case I would say maybe the takana of Chazal does not apply, and even if it was built into the sukkah, because in the end of the day it's not exactly like a regular structure. So here the gazlan does have to return these boards to the owner. Kamash Malon, that was the chiddush of Ravina, that even boards built into a sukkah does not have to be returned. But here the Gemara clarifies regarding how this takana applies by the sukkah. Hani mili begoy shiva. This is all said within the 7 days of Sukkot. At that time, it's considered to be a binyan kavua for the mitzvah, and therefore you don't have to return the materials itself. Aval abasa shiva. But after the 7 days of Sukkot, so you're dismantling your sukkah, so hadabine, you have to give back the materials as is, not just the value, but the actual materials that you stole. Now, if however he attached the materials to the structure of the sukkah with mortar, so then he made it permanent, so then even after the 7 days of Sukkot, you only pay back the value of these materials that you stole. Now the Gemara returns to the next halacha of the Mishnah, which was a yavish, a dry lulav. So in the Mishnah it said a dry lulav is pasul. So here the Gemara brings Tana and a Braisa we learned yavish pasul. Tanakama says a dry lulav is pasul. Rabbi Yehuda machshe. Rabbi Yehuda, however, says that a dry lulav is kosher. Amar Rava, so Rava explains machloik is belulav. They're arguing specifically about a dry lulav. And what's the basis of their argument? The Rabbanan Savri, Makshinon, Lulav Le'esrik. Rabbanan's opinion is we compare Lulav to Esrik. Ma Esrik by Hadar. Just like by Esrik, the Torah clearly writes Hadar, that has to be a beautiful Esrik. Af Lulav by Hadar. So too a Lulav has to be a beautiful Lulav, and therefore dry Lulav does not qualify. For Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is Loi Makshinon Lulav Le'esrik. We don't compare a Lulav to an Esrik, and therefore so according to this, if that's the whole basis of their machlokes, by esrig, where the Torah clearly writes hadar, everybody would agree that it has to be a beautiful esrig and not a dry esrig. Ubelulev, so the Gemara now questions this. Ubelulev leiboy Rabbi Yehuda hadar. Is it true that regarding a lulav, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require it to be a beautiful lulav? But Vatnan, in a Mishnah it says, in the first Mishnah, the Perek, so it said, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda said regarding a lulav that the leaves of the lulav are spread apart. Yagdanamul maila, you should bind it on the top to bring the leaves together. My time, what's the reason to bind it together? Lav mishum deboy hada. Isn't the reason because it has to be a beautiful lulav, and the leaves spread out does not look beautiful? So the Gemara answers, Loi, that's not the reason. Rather, kidiktani taima. The reason is that it was explained that Rabbi Yehuda mishum Rab Tarfon. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rab Tarfon that kapes tamarim, the Torah writes that the lulav should be a branch from a palm tree, so it could also be read kofos, that it should be bound together. And therefore, if the branches or the leaves of the lulav are separated, yichafsenu, you should tie it together, that it should be one, it should be like a stick, like together as one thing. This is what's always brought in Chassidus b'negei to what's unique about the lulav. Why dafke the lulav amongst the Dal Minim is chosen for the mitzvah, because it shows on the achtos of the Eibishter, even within what grows. You could see here the achtos of how these leaves grow tight together, kofos. The Gemara questions further. V'loi boy hadar. Does Rabbi Yehuda not require hadar for a lulav? But vatnam, we learned in the Mishnah, ein oigdenes a lulav ela b'minoi. When it comes to tying the lulav together with the adasim and the aravis, you could only tie it from its own species. You can't take from anything else. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. My time, why can't you use any other rope or whatever it is to tie it together? Lav mishum de boy hadar. Isn't the reason because Rabbi Yehuda requires it to be beautiful, and it's only beautiful if you use from its own min. Loi, the Gemara answers that's not the reason. The Ha'amar Rava, because we could see that Rava said afila b'siv. You could even use it from some other kind of material that grows around the palm tree. V'afila bi'ikra the dikli, even from the roots of the palm tree as well. And that's not something that's necessarily beautiful. It's a completely different color, and it doesn't have any beautiful look. So why is it that you have to tie the lulav dafka from its own min? Vela, my time that Rabbi Yehuda hasam. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda there? The kasavar, because Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is lulav tzarech eged. This tying of the lulav is part of the mitzvah. It must be tied together. V'imaisi mina achrine. So if you're going to tie your lulav with a different species, so then have a lo chamisha minim. So then you don't have only 4 minim. You have over here as something that you're using that's part of the mitzvah. And it's a different species that's not part of the mitzvah of the Dal Minim. So you have a 5th min. If you at all lulav does not need an eged and you tie it there, so then it's not even something that's needed. It's not part of the mitzvah. So it's not an added thing to the mitzvah. You're not over on the lav of Bal Taisif. But if it's needed for the mitzvah and you're using a 5th min to add this as a necessary part of the mitzvah, then it would be an issue of Bal Taisif. That's the issue. There's nothing to do with the concept of hadar. Now the Gemara questions what Rava said. Rava said that when it comes to esrig, everybody agrees, even Rabbi Yehuda, that it must be hadar. Ube esrig mi boy Rabbi Yehuda hadar? Regarding esrig, does Rabbi Yehuda require hadar? But Vatanya, we learned in the Braisa the following halachas. Arbas minim shebelulav, the 4 minim of the lulav, kishem shem peiches mehem, just like you can't have less than 4, kachem meisifen aleim, so too you can't have more than 4. Lei matz esrig, in a case where a person can't find an esrig, so what do you do? You can't replace it with any other fruit, not a quince, not a pomegranate, and not any other fruit. The Gemara will soon say what the chiddush of this is. Kemushin, an esrog that's partially dry, ksherin, is still kosher. Yeveshin, an esrog that's completely dry, psulin is puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda says, af yeveshin, even if it's completely dry, it still could be used for the mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda additionally brought a rayat, his opinion, he said, Maiseh b'bnei krachen. There was a story with the people that were living out in certain cities, and large cities, and they did not have these orchards of esrogim in their area. Shayim Rishin, es lulavei and levnei b'nein. They would inherit, they would give over the lulavim, and their descendants would inherit these lulavim, even though they were completely dry, they would still use it for the mitzvah. So therefore you see that even a dry lulav is kosher. So the Chachamim didn't accept this raya. Amru Loi, they said to him, that's the girsa that should be here. Misham raya, from that incident is a raya. Ein shas atchak raya. You can't prove from a case where they had no other choice. They were in a difficult situation. There's a machlekes rishonim about this. Some say that it was a shas atchak and they used this dry lulav, but they couldn't make a bracha. They can't be yaitz the mitzvah, but they just did it as a zeicha for the mitzvah. But others, however, say that no, because you learn out the requirement to have a fresh lulav from hadar, it doesn't clearly say in the Torah that if it's dry, it's puzzle. So therefore, in certain cases, we can interpret and say that this still qualifies. Chachamim say that in such a case of shas atchak, minat Torah, it's good and you can make a bracha on it. Either way, what comes out of here? Katani miyas, it says here in this brayse, Rabbi Yehuda, af yeveshin ksherin. Even a dry one is also kosher. My lava esrig. Don't you think he's referring even to a dry esrig? Because right before this in the brayse, it was speaking about a person that doesn't have an esrig. He shouldn't bring instead another type of fruit. And then right after that it discusses dry. So isn't the dry referring to a dry esrig? So the Gemara says no, it's not a question. Loi alulav. It's actually referring to the lulav. The brayse begins with arbas minin shebelulav, and when Rabbi Yehuda said that a dry lulav is going to be kosher, he meant lulav, not any of the other minim. Amamar. It said before in this brayse, kishem shem peichsamem, just like you can't minimize from the 4 minim, kachem misif and aleim, you can't add either. Pshita. It's obvious. The Torah says 4 minim. Why would I think you should add? Now, the time I would think to say, since Rabbi Yehuda says that the lulav requires to be tied together. And v'i maisi mina achrine. So therefore, if you're adding another species here, and you're not tying it together with the other meaning that are being tied together. I'm sorry about the noise here. I'm in camp and it's color war. Okay, we're going to continue. So if I would think v'i maisi mina achrine, if you bring another species, hailu chodekoi v'hailu chodekoi. So the four minim that are tied together are actually the three minim, the adasim, the lulav, and the aravis, that are tied. Sorry, just a second. The three minim that are tied together are considered to be in the mitzvah. Another min that you may add, but if it's not bound together, it's not added to the mitzvah. It's not part of the mitzvah, and therefore you wouldn't be over on Bal Taisif. Even if, now Taisus here clarifies, so it's an interesting thing. You would be Mekayim the mitzvah because this min is not bound together. Now, since you're being Mekayim the mitzvah because this added min is not bound together, you would think that you're not over on Bal Taisif. Kamash Malon, that's the Chiddush here, that you actually are over on Bal Taisif, even if you're fulfilling the mitzvah because it's not bound together, but because you added a min, you are over on Bal Taisif. Amamar, the master said before, that if you did not find an esrig, do not bring another kind of fruit, not a rimoin, pomegranate or quince, not any other fruit. Fragt the Gemara, pshita, obviously. Why would I think you could use another fruit for the mitzvah? I would think to say, laisi, you should bring something as a replacement. So you shouldn't forget about the mitzvah of esrig, even if you won't be doing the mitzvah, but as a zeicha for the mitzvah to remember it. Kamash Malon, that's the chiddush that you should not do so because zimnin the nafik churva minei. This could also bring that in the future it'll be in the something bad and negative. Dasila misrach, you might come to follow and do this in the future, even when you do have esrog, and you will think that another fruit is also acceptable. Toshama, going back to the chiddush that Rava said that a dry esrog, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees, is pasul. So there's a brayse that says esrig hayashan, an old esrig which is dried up, pasul is pasul. And Rabbi Yehuda machshe, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So here we have a clear brayse. To Yufte, the Rava, this refutes Rava's opinion. To Yufte, his opinion is refuted. Rabbi Yehuda clearly says even a dry esrig is kosher. Now the Gemara questions this. So now the conclusion is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no requirement of hadar by esrig. Fragt the Gemara, boy, hadar? Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require hadar for an esrig. But now we learned in the Mishnah, yoruk karti, an esrig that's as green as leek, very deep green, almost like black. There's different shades actually to this color. There's a lengthy taisus here about exactly what shade we're talking about. Rab Meir machsher, Rab Meir says it's kosher, and Rab Yehuda paisa. Rab Yehuda is the one that says that it's pasul. Lav, don't you think the reason is mishum de boy hadar? Because you have to have a beautiful esrig, and this is not a beautiful color. So the Gemara says, loy, that's not the reason. Rather, mishum, the loy, gemar, peire, because this is not a ripe fruit, and therefore you're not yetz the mitzvah. Toshema, another question over here on this. Shiur esrig, it comes to the size of an esrig, cotton, it's the smallest size of an esrig. Rav Meir says, ke'egais, the smallest esrig is like a walnut. Rabbi Yehuda ke'beitza. Rabbi Yehuda says the smallest esrig is like the size of an egg. So Lav, why do you think Rabbi Yehuda requires a larger esrig? Mishum de boyad, because Rabbi Yehuda thinks that it says it has to be more beautiful, a larger esrig. So you see that he requires hadar. So the Gemara answers, loida, again, it's not the reason, rather Mishum de legmar peire, because it's not a ripe fruit. Toshama, third question, it says ubegadol. How large could the largest esrig be? Kidei sheyachois shnayim biyadei achas, that he could hold two esrogim in one hand. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yosi says, afila achas b'shtei yadav. Even if the esrig is so large that it needs two hands to hold one esrig, it's still kosher. Well, now what's their argument about? My time. What is the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? Lav, don't you think the reason is mishum debai hadar? Because he needs to be a beautiful esrig, and a esrig that's so huge and bulky is not a beautiful fruit. And therefore it has to be small enough that you can hold two esrogim in one hand. So the Gemara again says, loy, that's not the reason. Rather, kivin the Amar Rabba. Since Rabba said, lulav biyamin and esrig is bismail. The lulav goes in the right hand, and that's because the lulav comes along with the dasim and the aravis. So you have three minim, so it should be in the right hand. And the esrig is in the left hand. So zimnin, sometimes what could happen is the michla filet that a person exchanges, and he took the lulav into his left hand, and the esrog into his right hand. V'asi lafuchinu. And then he has to exchange them. He put them in the wrong hand, and now he has to exchange hands. V'asi lifsuli. If you have such a large esrog and you can't balance to hold them and to exchange hands, you might drop it, you might make the esrog puzzle. So maybe there was so in other words, the point over here is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since maybe this could happen, there was a gzeira that you should not use such a large esrog in order to be able to maneuver the esrog, to be able to hold the esrog and the lulav in one hand, if you have to exchange the hands. But it has nothing to do with the requirement of hadar. So now let's go back to the pasuk. So if according to Rabbi Yehuda there's no requirement of hadar, of a beautiful esrog, but aksiv hadar, the Torah refers to the esrog as hadar. So the Gemara answers, Ahu, that word hadar means something else. Hadar bi'ilanai mishana l'shana. The esrog is a fruit that can remain on the tree from one year to the next. It goes through all the seasons and it keeps on growing, and that's the meaning of the word hadar. It identifies what fruit we're talking about. This is also something that's brought in many Maimarim of Chassidus to explain why the esrog was chosen, because it shows on the concept of achtos, the fact that it could tolerate all the seasons. Not only tolerate, but actually it grows from all the seasons. It unites all the seasons together. That's the reason why this esrog shows on the concept of achtos. The next thing it said in the Mishnah was shalasheda v'shalir anidachas, esrog that comes from an asheda tree, an avodah zarah tree, or it comes from an ir anidachas is puzzle. So the question is, v'shal asheda puzzle. If it comes from an asheda, it's puzzle. But v'ha'amar Rave said, lulav shal avodah zarah, a lulav that comes from avodah zarah lo yitail, it should not be used, because if it comes from avodah zarah, it's disgusting to be used for a mitzvah, as Rashi says. But v'im natal b'di'ever, if you did use it, kosher, it's kosher. So if so, why can't we use a lulav from an asheda tree? B'di'ever, it should be acceptable. So the Gemara answers, Hacha ba'asheda de Moshe askinan. Here we're talking about specifically this kind of asheda tree in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. What does the pasuk say? As Rashi here brings, Va'ashereim tisrfum be'esh, that you have to burn those trees. The chsusi mechses shiure, because it's destined to be burned. Even now, when it still exists, it has no shiur. It's as if it's burnt already, and therefore it doesn't have the minimum shiur of what a lulav has to be. 3 tfachim plus another tefach for shaking it. That's the reason why it's possible. Deiken Ami, to prove to you that this is the pshat, the Ktani, because in the Mishnah it says, Dumye the ir anidachas. It brings the asheda tree together with the ir anidachas. And the psul by ir anidachas is the same point, because it's destined to be burnt, so it's as if it's burnt already and it has no shiur. Shmami, no, this is a proof that that's the correct pshat in the Mishnah.